On the morning of July 21st, 1786, the town of New London, Connecticut, was bathed in sunlight, unaware of the horror it was about to witness. Around 10 a.m., a local passerby walking along a quiet path discovered something that would leave the entire community in shock: the lifeless body of a little girl. She was just 6 years old, and her name was Eunice Bowles. Her small figure lay motionless on the side of the road, her face showing signs of trauma, and it soon became apparent that this was no accident. Someone had deliberately strangled her. The news of the gruesome murder of such a young, innocent girl spread like wildfire through the town. People were horrified. New London wasn't used to such brutality, especially not involving children. Eunice came from a well-off family. Her father was a prosperous farmer, well-respected and known throughout the area. The brutal killing of a child from such a background raised even more alarm. The local authorities quickly launched an investigation. A murder of this scale, particularly involving a child, was rare and deeply unsettling. The town demanded answers. Among those questioned in the early stages of the investigation was a 12-year-old girl named Hannah Akiwish. Her name was already familiar to many. Hannah was known in town not in a good way, but as a troubled, unpredictable child who frightened many of the other children. The authorities thought it necessary to speak to her, considering her past behavior and reputation, to understand why Hannah was suspected. I must look at her life leading up to that point. Hannah Akiwish had not lived an easy life. She was of mixed Pequot Native American descent, and in 18th century America, this already put her at a disadvantage. But even beyond race, her personal circumstances were harsh. Her mother, described as unstable, would frequently abandon her for long periods. Her father had disappeared from the picture entirely. Hannah grew up without any real structure, support, or guidance. She was a child of neglect and hardship, and her behavior began to reflect that from an early age. At just 6 years old, Hannah was caught stealing fruit from a local orchard. It was her first documented offense, and for many, the first sign that something wasn't right. What began as small thefts eventually escalated into more serious acts. By the time she was 10, Hannah and her older brother had begun to rob other children. They didn't just steal, they used violence. On one occasion, they beat up a young girl and took a gold locket from her neck. That crime finally caught the attention of the authorities, and both siblings were sent into foster care, known at the time as a place for wayward or orphaned children where the government could keep watch over them. 2 years passed. Hannah remained in foster care, but the intervention seemed to do little to change her nature. The emotional scars and anger she carried were not healed by being in government care. She was eventually released and began living again in New London. At 12, she found work in a woman's home as a domestic helper. But despite having a roof over her head and a job, Hannah had not changed. Not long after her return, complaints began to surface. Children in the neighborhood reported being harassed and bullied by her. Some said she would sneak up on them and make threats. Others said she would try to take things from them. Her presence was intimidating to the other kids in the area. Fear began to spread. Even adults started to become wary of her. Then came June 1786, a few weeks before the murder, when a seemingly minor event set the stage for tragedy. Children from the town often gathered near the outskirts, near strawberry fields, where they would collect berries in their baskets and play under the summer sun. Among them that day was Eunice Bowles. Like the others, she was filling her basket with strawberries, enjoying the simplicity and sweetness of childhood. But then Hannah arrived. She went straight up to Eunice and dumped the little girl's strawberries into her own basket. When Eunice started crying, a few nearby adults noticed and scolded Hannah for her behavior. That moment, a public scolding. A child's tears may seem trivial in hindsight, but for Hannah, it became an event she could not forget. She was humiliated. Something inside her turned darker. A resentment began to grow, and a disturbing desire to retaliate took root. Weeks passed. On the morning of July 21st, just 5 weeks after the strawberry field incident, Eunice Bowles was walking to school. The town was just waking up and everything seemed calm. But then, from seemingly nowhere, Hannah appeared in her path. What happened next was a horrifying act that shocked even the most seasoned authorities. Hannah, a 12-year-old child, strangled 6-year-old Eunice to death and left her body on the roadside before fleeing the scene. When the body was discovered, police wasted no time. The case moved quickly because of the brutality involved and because witnesses had already associated Hannah with odd behavior. She was immediately brought in for questioning. At first, Hannah tried to deflect suspicion. She claimed that earlier in the morning, she had seen 4 boys heading in the same direction as Eunice and implied they may have been involved in the crime. But the police, though working in a time with far fewer investigative tools, were not convinced. They began to question the story. Her alibi didn't hold, and soon cracks began to show. Eventually, under pressure and without the skill to maintain her lie, Hannah confessed. She admitted that she had killed Eunice. The admission came not only as a breakthrough in the case, but also as a national shock. The idea of a 12-year-old child committing such a brutal act with no apparent remorse at first was almost unbelievable, and so began one of the most tragic and disturbing legal proceedings in early American history. With her confession in hand, the police moved swiftly to hand Hannah Aquash over to the court. This was 1786, a time when America was still young, and its justice system was in its formative years. Yet, even in those early days, what to do with a 12-year-old murderer became an intensely debated question. No one could deny that a brutal crime had taken place, and no one questioned that Hannah was the one who committed it. The challenge was deciding what kind of punishment was fitting not just for justice, but for a child. Word of the murder and the arrest spread quickly. It's not only within New London but across the state, and eventually through much of New England. Newspapers picked up the story, and the public became captivated. After all, how often did you hear about a young girl strangling a 6-year-old to death? The crime was shocking, the accused even more so. People who knew Hannah recalled her troubled past, while others speculated about what could have driven a child to such violence. Many were torn. Some believed she was dangerous and needed to be dealt with harshly.
Hello.
Others wondered whether she was more a victim of her upbringing than a natural-born criminal. The court proceedings began in late 1786. It was not a fast process, and even by the standards of the time, it was unusual. Children were rarely put on trial for murder, and when they were, it seldom reached the level of intensity this case did. The courtroom was small and plain, typical of the period, with wooden benches and no elaborate legal system in place. But on the days Hannah appeared, the room was packed. Curious townspeople, journalists, and legal observers came to witness something that hadn't been seen before. A girl, barely into her teens, on trial for her life. Hannah sat quietly in the courtroom. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. Some observers later described her as eerily calm, while others believed her silence was the result of emotional trauma, or perhaps not fully grasping the seriousness of the situation. Her defense team, if it could even be called that, was not equipped to fight the case with modern legal standards. In those days, even capital trials were often quick and lacked the kind of representation we now consider a basic right. There were no child psychologists, no social workers, and no legal protections for juveniles. Hannah faced adult consequences in an adult courtroom. During the trial, the prosecution laid out the sequence of events: the fight over strawberries, the embarrassment Hannah suffered, the growing resentment.
Right.
And then, finally, the cold-blooded act of murder. They presented the confession which Hannah had signed. There was no forensic evidence in 1786, no fingerprints, no DNA, but in this case, none was needed. Hannah had admitted it. Her own words sealed her fate more firmly than anything else. The judge presiding over the case was known to be a man of both legal knowledge and deep emotion. It said that during Hannah's trial, he became visibly upset more than once. To see such a young girl accused of something so cruel and yet remain silent and unrepentant struck even hardened men. Witnesses later wrote that he wiped away tears during one session, overcome by the gravity of what was happening. Still, the judge knew that the law had to be followed. And the law, as it stood in 1786, allowed the death penalty for murder, even if the person responsible was only 12. But he wrestled with that reality. In a statement before sentencing, the judge addressed not just Hannah, but the entire courtroom. He explained that while her age gave him great pause, letting her go unpunished would be even more dangerous. If I allow her to walk free, he said, simply because she is young, what message do we send? That a child can commit such a terrible act and face no consequence. That would be a greater injustice still. These words, though spoken in the late 18th century, reflected a dilemma societies continue to wrestle with today. How should children be held accountable for adult crimes? The verdict came soon after. Hannah Ukwish was sentenced to death by hanging. The room reportedly went silent when the sentence was read aloud. Some people gasped. Others sat in stunned silence. Even those who had followed the case closely and believed she deserved punishment were not prepared for this outcome. To hang a child, a 12-year-old girl, was a punishment most could barely comprehend. Yet it was the law, and in this case, the law was clear. The execution date was set for December 20th, 1786. That gave Hannah just a few more months to live. She was returned to jail, where she awaited her fate. At the time, executions were not private events. They were held in public, often in open fields or town squares, and drew large crowds. They were treated as both a punishment and a deterrent, a lesson to those who watched. Hannah's execution would be no different. Preparations began to make it a public event. As news of the sentence spread, public opinion grew even more divided. Some supported the decision. They argued that the law had been upheld and justice served. Others, however, were deeply disturbed. Was it right to hang a child, no matter the crime? Did Hannah really understand the gravity of what she had done? Was she a cold-hearted murderer, or a damaged child who had never been given a chance? In her final weeks, Hannah reportedly remained quiet. She didn't speak much to guards, nor did she ask for anything. It's unclear whether she understood what was about to happen. Accounts suggest that only on the morning of her execution did she fully realize her fate. They say that when the day arrived, she began to cry uncontrollably. As the cold winter crept into New London in late 1786, the day that had been looming for months finally approached, December 20th. The date set for the execution of Hannah Ukwish. She was just 12 years old, a child condemned to die for the murder of a 6-year-old girl, Eunice Bowles. The people of the town had followed the story with fascination, horror, and debate. Now they would witness its final chapter. Executions in 18th century America were grim public affairs. They were intended to make an example of the condemned, to serve as a lesson to the community. In a time before police forces and modern prisons, the death penalty was seen as one of the few tools available to deter crime. But the hanging of a child was not something even hardened citizens took lightly. Preparations for the execution were made well in advance. A gallows was built outside the jail, a simple wooden structure with a rope, a platform, and a crowd space. By the morning of the 20th, people had begun gathering near the site. Men, women, and even children came to witness what they knew would be a historic and haunting event. Many came out of a sense of obligation, some from curiosity, and others out of a grim desire to see justice carried out. Inside her cell, Hannah sat alone. There were no family members to visit her, no comforting presence in her final hours. Mother had long been absent from her life, and no one else had come forward. She was a child abandoned by the world, a symbol of both crime and neglect. Accounts from that morning suggest that only then did the full weight of what was happening strike her. When guards came to collect her, she began to cry not softly but uncontrollably. The bravado or numbness she had displayed during the trial was gone. Now, she was simply a terrified girl. Some witnesses later said her sobbing echoed through the corridors of the jail. She was dressed in a plain, modest gown, the kind that girls her age wore at the time. There were no shoes on her feet, only stockings. Her hands trembled. Her lips quivered. But she walked. Whether by strength or by resignation, she followed the guards outside. where hundreds of eyes fell upon her. The walk from the jail to the gallows was short but unforgettable. The crowd stood silent as she passed. The image of a crying 12-year-old girl being led to her own execution was something no one present would ever forget. The minister walked beside her, reading from Scripture, offering final words of repentance and forgiveness. Hannah reportedly said very little. She wept, but she did not plead for her life. Perhaps she knew there was no one left to hear her plea. At the gallows, a hush fell over the crowd. The executioner, a man who had likely never before hanged. A child prepared the rope. Hannah was guided up the wooden steps to the platform. Her legs shook. Some reports say she nearly collapsed and had to be held up. The minister offered her one last chance to speak. She said nothing, only tears. The noose was placed around her neck, and then with a signal, the trapdoor beneath her feet was released. It was over in seconds. Hannah Akuish was dead. She became one of the youngest people in American history to be executed by the state. Her body was later buried in an unmarked grave, her short and tragic life ending without ceremony or recognition. The reaction in the town was a complex one. There were no cheers, no celebrations. Most people returned to their homes in silence, haunted by what they had witnessed. Justice, perhaps, had been served according to the law, but morally, many found themselves unsettled. The image of a small girl hanging from a rope stayed with them for years. Even the judge who had sentenced her to death was said to have been emotionally shaken. In the days that followed, letters were written to local newspapers. Some defended the execution. They pointed to the brutal nature of the crime, the deliberate act of strangling a 6-year-old girl, and said that justice had no age. But others questioned the morality of executing a child who had grown up abandoned, neglected, and perhaps even mentally impaired. In truth, Hannah's case was more than just a murder trial. It was a reflection of the society that produced her. A society where poor children, especially Native American girls, were given no real support. A time when mental illness was not understood and trauma was ignored. A time when a child could be raised in the shadows and punished with death without anyone ever asking why she had become what she was. Over the years, Hannah Akuish's story faded from public memory. It wasn't taught in schools. Her name disappeared from headlines, but it never truly vanished. Historians would later rediscover her case, shocked at how such a young girl had been condemned to death. Her execution remains one of the darkest moments in the history of juvenile justice in the United States. Modern legal experts often cite her case when discussing the treatment of children in the criminal justice system. In fact, Hannah's story helped spark future generations of reformers who questioned whether children should ever be tried and punished as adults. Today, executing a 12-year-old would be unthinkable in the U.S., and illegal under both national and international law. But in 1786, Hannah had no such protections. Perhaps what makes Hannah's story so tragic is not just the crime she committed, but the life she lived before it. A child abandoned, a child abused, a child left to become something monstrous because no one stepped in to help her when it mattered most. And so, while the town of New London continued with its daily life after the execution, the memory of that cold December morning never fully disappeared. It became a shadow in American history, a case studied by scholars, discussed by legal minds, and quietly mourned by those who still ask, could her fate have been different? In the days that followed the execution of Hannah Akuish, an eerie stillness settled over New London. Life resumed in appearance, shops reopened, church bells rang. Children went back to school, but for many in the town, something had changed. The memory of watching a child hanged in the public square was not easily shaken. It lingered like a cold wind, spring through quiet streets and unsettling hearts. Hannah's death was a legal act, fully authorized by the court and consistent with the law of the land. Yet for many, it didn't feel like justice. It felt like tragedy layered on top of tragedy. A child had killed another child, and now both were gone. One buried by her family in grief, and the other buried by the state in anonymity. No one could bring back Eunice Bowles, the 6-year-old girl who was strangled that summer. Her family had suffered a loss beyond imagination. But the execution of her killer had done little to ease their pain. It was a final act that brought closure, only in theory, not in spirit. The judge, who had been composed and firm during the sentencing, was said to have spoken very little in the days after Hannah's execution. Those close to him claimed he struggled with the decision. He had followed the law, but the emotional burden of condemning a 12-year-old to death weighed heavily on him. In his chambers, he reportedly wrote letters not to defend his decision, but to express sorrow over what had become necessary under the system he was sworn to uphold. Others in the community were also divided. Some insisted that Hannah's punishment had been fair. They pointed to her confession, the calculated nature of her actions, and her prior violent behavior. In their view, society had to protect itself, even if the threat came in the form of a child. Others, however, could not reconcile themselves with what had happened. These were the people who looked at Hannah and saw not only a killer, but a lost child, one failed by her family, abandoned by her community, and ultimately destroyed by a world that offered her no kindness. The local newspapers ran articles on the event, most of them brief. One paper noted the rarity of the case. Another reported the details of the execution with a kind of cold detachment, a reflection of the times. There was no national outcry, no investigation, no protests. In 1786, there were no advocacy groups for children's rights, no psychologists analyzing criminal behavior in youth. Society was not ready to ask deeper questions, but the whispers persisted. In homes, people spoke of Hannah's weeping on the gallows. Teachers told students to behave or they'd end up like that girl. Children in the area began having nightmares. The story spread beyond New London and into nearby towns, where it took on the tone of a cautionary tale. For some, Hannah became a symbol of ultimate justice. For others, she was the embodiment of a broken system. What few people knew was just how completely alone Hannah had been. In her short life, there had been no stability. Her mother, said to have mental health problems of her own, had disappeared. For long stretches, her father had left before she was even old enough to remember him. There had been no schooling, no guidance, no mentorship. She had lived through hunger, homelessness, and rejection. And while this did not excuse what she had done to Eunice Bowles, it painted a more complete picture of who Hannah Akiwish really was. Modern historians have pointed out that Hannah may have had intellectual disabilities or developmental disorders. Though such diagnoses did not exist at the time, observers from that era noted her delayed speech, her inconsistent behavior, and her limited understanding of consequences. In today's world, she may have received special education, therapy, or even been considered unfit to stand trial. But in 1786, none of those possibilities existed. She was tried, judged, and executed all before reaching her teenage years. After her execution, no one claimed Hannah's body. No grave marker was placed. No ceremony was held. She was buried by jail staff in an unmarked grave on the outskirts of town. Over the years, that burial site was forgotten. Today, no one knows exactly where Hannah's remains lie. It's as if history tried to bury her story alongside her body, but it never fully succeeded. The Bowles family, for their part, withdrew from public life for a time. The loss of their daughter had already shattered them. Whatever satisfaction came from seeing her killer punished could not erase the hole left in their lives. Eunice had been described as a kind, playful, and cheerful child. Her death had been as senseless as it was brutal. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, the target of someone else's bottled-up pain and rage. Years passed, and the memory of the case began to fade. Children who had watched the execution grew up and moved on. Buildings changed, streets were renamed, but somewhere in the local consciousness, the story of Hannah Akiwish remained, a silent reminder of a time when a child could be both victim and villain, punished not just for her actions but perhaps also for her upbringing. Occasionally, older residents would mention the story to the younger generation. A teacher might mention the girl who got hanged during a lesson on early American law. A local historian might include a line or two in a town chronicle. But for the most part, Hannah became a ghost, a presence felt but rarely acknowledged. That began to change in the 20th century. When scholars researching juvenile justice came across the records of her trial and execution, shocked by the age listed just 12, they began to dig deeper. What they found was not just a court case, but a portrait of an entire system that had failed. Academics began writing articles. Legal historians used her case as a turning point in conversations about the ethics of capital punishment for juveniles. Slowly, Hannah Okiusha's name re-entered the public discussion, not as a footnote, but as a symbol of injustice, of a society still learning how to care for its most vulnerable, and of a history we cannot afford to forget. More than 2 centuries have passed since the day Hannah Okiusha was executed, yet her story continues to echo, quietly but powerfully, in the conversation about justice and childhood. While the world has changed dramatically since that cold day in December 1786, questions raised by Hannah's life and death remain as relevant now as they were then, in modern times. Her case has been re-examined, not just by legal scholars and historians, but by advocates for juvenile justice around the world. It's been featured in academic journals, university lectures, and books exploring the evolution of criminal law. What shocks readers most today isn't just the age at which Hannah was sentenced to death, but how little support she received throughout her short life. She was, in every sense, a child abandoned by her family, society, and the legal system, until she committed an irreversible act that forced the world to pay attention. Hannah's execution took place before the U.S. Constitution had even been fully ratified, and long before the Bill of Rights would influence how justice was administered. In the 1700s, there were no age-specific protections. Children as young as 7 were considered criminally responsible. There was no understanding of trauma, no framework for rehabilitation, and no mercy coded into the justice system for youth. The world in which Hannah lived saw children more as miniature adults than as vulnerable beings still learning right from wrong. But her case helped change that slowly, quietly, and over time. It became a point of reference for those arguing that children, no matter how severe their crimes, should not be treated the same as adults. Her name began appearing in legal papers and advocacy reports as an example of what happens when a justice system operates without compassion. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Roper v. Simmons that it was unconstitutional to impose the death penalty for crimes committed by juveniles under 18. The spirit of Hannah Okiusha's case loomed silently in the background. She had become, posthumously, a symbol of reform. But outside of legal circles, Hannah's name remained relatively unknown. She wasn't taught in school curriculums. There were no memorials erected in her honor, no gravesite to leave flowers. For most people in New London, she was a chapter long forgotten. It wasn't until historians began to dive into court archives and colonial documents that her story was revived, not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. What they found was haunting. A girl whose first crime, stealing fruit at age 6, had already signaled a life of desperation. A child who had been removed from her home but placed into a system that didn't heal, only contained. A girl who never had a stable family, who was exposed to violence, and who may have struggled with cognitive disabilities or emotional trauma, all of which were ignored. And ultimately a girl who committed a horrific crime but who received punishment instead of help, judgment. Instead of understanding, some have asked, could Hannah's story have ended differently? Would today's systems, child protective services, mental health care, education outreach, have caught her before it was too late? Would a teacher or neighbor have intervened? Would she have been sent to therapy instead of foster care? Supported instead of scolded? We will never know. But the questions matter, because they are the same questions still being asked today. In courtrooms where teenagers face life-altering sentences, in schools where children with difficult behavior are written off, in communities where poverty and neglect remain, powerful forces shaping young lives. Hannah's story may be set in the 18th century, but its lessons are very much modern. That's why, in recent years, some have begun to speak her name again, not as a killer, but as a reminder that justice without compassion is incomplete, that childhood is fragile and that behind every act of violence, there is often a deeper history of pain that went unnoticed for too long. There have even been discussions among scholars and activists about creating a memorial or historical marker in New London, not to glorify the crime, but to acknowledge the humanity of the child at the center of it. Some have suggested that her grave, wherever it may be, should be marked not erased from memory, but respected as part of American history. Nothing can undo what happened, but memory itself can be an act of dignity. In 1786, Hannah's name was written into legal records with ink and condemnation. But today, her name is also written into a different kind of legacy, one of reflection, awareness, and the long, painful growth of a society learning to be better. She was not just the youngest person ever executed in American history. She was also a child who never had a chance. Final thoughts? In the end, the story of Hannah Aquash is not simply about a crime or a punishment. It is about a failure, not just of an individual, but of a society that could not see the warning signs, that did not ask the right questions, and that chose finality over forgiveness. And that is why her story must be remembered, not to relive the pain, but to ensure that no other child is ever left so completely alone or judged so completely without mercy.